Hi, I'm your host, Michael Fox. 3 things I want to say before I begin. First, you may have noticed that it's been 2 weeks since our last episode came out, episode 6, USS Honduras. That is on purpose. We've decided to slow down the release of each new episode to every 2 weeks because, well, to be honest, I need time to make them. In other words, a new episode of Under the Shadow will drop every second and fourth Tuesday of the month until early May. I promise they will be worth the wait. Second, we've decided to split this episode into 2 parts. There's just so much to say. There's a ton of backstory, and frankly, you can't talk about the 2009 coup in Honduras without getting into everything that's happened since, up until today. It's another sign of the never-ending legacy that US-backed coups leave on a place. So we're bringing you part 1 this week and part 2 next time. Finally, many portions of today's episode deal with harsh themes from the weeks and months following the 2009 coup, such as killings and disappearances. If you're sensitive to these things or you're in the room with small children, you might want to consider another time to listen. Okay, here's the show. Tontines International Airport, Tegucigalpa, Honduras. It's this big, long, rectangular building, glass windows out front, several kind of gray, silver, circular columns out in front of it. It's right in Tegucigalpa. I mean, it's on the outskirts, but it's a major highway running, it's just adjacent to it, 5-lane highway. Fast food stores, Pizza Hut, Burger King, Little Caesars, Church's Chicken, Cinemark, Dunkin' Donuts, a big mall outside. This is it's not a huge airport. They say the runway, in fact, is relatively small. And so they've opened up the Palmarola International Airport just north of here. Today it's a windy day, blue sky, and I'm here because this was one of the most intense and would become one of the most emblematic moments of resistance against the 2009 coup against Manuel Zelaya here in Tegucigalpa. Thousands of people have marched to the airport from across Tegucigalpa. They're there to greet President Manuel Zelaya, who was attempting to fly back into Honduras 5 days after he was ousted. In the early hours of June 28, 2009, the military had taken the president out of his home at gunpoint and put him on a flight to Costa Rica, still in his pajamas. People have protested in the streets ever since. Now, on the tarmac, soldiers and riot cops amass in long rows. In a corner of the runway, a group of protesters face off against the security forces. People are protesting, and the Honduran police open fire with live rounds against protesters right here on the tarmac. Zelaya isn't able to land. His plane turns around. Isis Obed Murillo. He was shot there on the runway, hit square in the back of his head. The first protester to be killed by state security forces following the coup. The first martyr, one of so many. In pictures and video from that time, he looks like a boy. And he is, only 19. Gray shirt, covered in blood. Several protesters grab him and carry him off to an ambulance, hoping he is still alive.
Yo no había visto.
I have never seen a situation like the one we experienced in the 2009 military coup, says Bertoliva. Remember, I spoke with her in the last episode. Her words carry a lot of weight. She's a founder and director of COFADE, the committee of the family members of the detained and disappeared in Honduras. And she witnessed the moment her husband was abducted in the 1980s, never to be seen again. She and other relatives of the disappeared organized to demand the return of their loved ones and to fight back against the brutal repression decades ago. And they had to relive it following the 2009 coup.
ver, por ejemplo, cómo caían manifestantes en la calle,
To see how protesters fell in the streets, she says, how they lost their lives in the moment, shot by the military. For us, that was shocking. For example, to see how they picked up Isis Obed amid the crossfire from the military, amid the multitude of thousands of people, how the military dispersed the crowd with firearms, some seriously hurt, one dead, Isis Obed, she says.
Isis que salió muerto.
Berta describes another death at the hands of the Honduran military, where protesters had to wait for the gunfire and tear gas to clear before they could retrieve their companion.
Y trataron en todo ese tiempo.
They tried to push fear into the people. It impacted the population psychologically, emotionally, she says.
Y además eran detenidos y detenidos.
Men and women were detained and tortured. They were murdered on the street in order to scare the population so that they would not demonstrate. They tried to dismantle the organizing, to stop the people from standing up, stop them from protesting, she says. Back in the 1980s, these kinds of repressive government tactics were successful at subduing the Honduran people and forcing them into silence. After the coup, that would happen no more.
Por eso fue la determinación de estar y permanecer.
People knew they had to protest, says Berta. If they didn't go out together to the streets, then they would be murdered in their homes. And some people who were killed, they were organizers and leaders in their communities, and the military hunted them down in their homes to kill them. So people knew they had to stand up together, she says. And they did, for more than 180 days in a row across the country. More on that in a minute. This is Under the Shadow, a new investigative narrative podcast series that walks back in time to tell the story of the past by visiting momentous places in the present. This podcast is a co-production in partnership with The Real News and NACLA. I'm your host, Michael Fox, longtime radio reporter, editor, journalist, the producer and host of the podcast Brazil on Fire. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years in Latin America. I've seen firsthand the role of the U.S. government abroad, and most often, sadly, it is not for the better. Invasions, coups, sanctions, support for authoritarian regimes. Politically and economically, the United States has cast a long shadow over Latin America for the past 200 years. In each episode in this series, I'll take you to a location where something historic happened, a landmark of revolutionary struggle or foreign intervention. Today, it might look like a random street corner, a church, a mall, a monument, or a museum. But every place I'm going to bring you was once the site of history-making events that shook countries, impacted lives, and left deep marks on the world. I'll try to discover what lingers of that history today. In the last episode, we traveled to 1980s Honduras. Today, we fast forward to 2009, to the coup that shattered Honduras' fragile democracy and again sunk the country into violence. But this time, the people responded like never before. This is Under the Shadow Season 1, Central America, Episode 7, 2009 Honduras, Part 1, La Resistencia. So before I dive back into the resistance, I want to take a step back and walk you up to 2009. And I'm going to take a little extra time to do this because this is the only episode of this season that focuses on such recent history. Okay, so we left the last episode in 1980s Honduras. State repression, disappearances, the overwhelming presence of the United States. Some U.S. officials even called the country the USS Honduras because the United States used it as a staging ground for its Cold War operations across Central America. By the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, those conflicts were starting to wind down.
The first waves of millions of Central Americans going to the U.S. All that history of forced migrancy and refugees and all that stuff. Oh, gee, I wonder why all this happened. It's because the U.S. crushed the region. And in power in the early mid-90s were all the same ruling elites that the U.S. had partnered with, the same military, the same political elites, the same economic elites, which is the key point. Military and economic are always the key ones.
Graham Russell is the director of Rights Action, a human rights organization that works with local communities in Guatemala and Honduras who are defending their land and territory. We've spoken with him often for previous episodes.
But the bad guys won is the simplification. It's very true in Honduras. The bad guys won. And by the late 90s, it is neoliberalism back on track. The economic model was really no different than the last umpteen years. The name's changed. We now call it neoliberalism. We don't call it Banana Republic or whatever, but it's the same thing. The rich in these countries use cheap labor or their rich lands or even minerals to partner with global companies, banks, exporters, etc. It's the same economic model, but it's now 1990s into the 2000s.
And Honduras is still a top U.S. ally in the region. Then, November 2005.
Camina ahora el señor presidente electo de la República, el ciudadano José Manuel Zelaya Rosales, al frente del estrado.
Presidential candidate Manuel Zelaya wins the Honduran presidential elections. He's a member of the Liberal Party, one of the two political forces that had traditionally traded power in Honduras. He is no revolutionary. This is not Che Guevara. Zelaya is a member of the country's ruling class, the oligarchy. His father, in fact, was a rich landowner who was even convicted of participating in a 1975 massacre where the Honduran military killed more than a dozen religious leaders, campesinos, and students. The bodies of the victims were found on Manuel Zelaya's father's ranch in the east of the country. Regardless, as president, Zelaya takes a surprising turn, listening to the demands of social movements. Remember, this is the heyday of the leftist pink tide in Latin America. By Zelaya's second year in office, Evo Morales is in power in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, Fidel Castro in Cuba, and of course,
Ayer estuvo el diablo aquí.
Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. That's him from the podium of the UN giving his infamous speech where he compares George W. Bush to the devil.
En este mismo lugar huele a azufre todavía.
In this very place, it still smells like sulfur, he says after crossing himself. He gave that speech on September 20th, 2006. Manuel Zelaya had been in power in Honduras for 8 months. Zelaya began to join the leftward tide. He got closer to Chavez and the region's other progressive leaders. In early 2008, Honduras, under Zelaya, joined the Venezuelan program Petrocaribe.
Honduras se abre a nuevas alternativas. Petrocaribe y Petroalimentos.
Remember, at that time, oil prices were high, and Venezuela had a lot of it. Basically, through Petrocaribe, Venezuela would ship oil at discounted rates that could be paid for over a long period of time. It was a huge support for many of the region's smaller and poorer countries like Nicaragua, and even the Caribbean nations of Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Dominica, St. Lucia, and of course, Cuba. By 2013, Venezuela had sent over 230 million barrels of oil to its Petrocaribe partners, meeting roughly 40% of their energy needs. Petrocaribe was a project of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, or ALBA. That trade bloc included most of the region's more progressive countries. The idea was to break with the hegemony of the United States in the region by forming their own regional group that did not bow down to U.S. interests, like, say, the Washington-based Organization of American States, or OAS. And the bloc is still around, though it doesn't have the same strength or prominence it once did.
Durante la cumbre del ALBA realizada en Tegucigalpa.
In August 2008, despite criticism from the United States and Zelaya's political opponents, Honduras joined the group. Zelaya held an international ALBA summit in Tegucigalpa to commemorate the country's entry into the bloc. We are here to tell everyone, Zelaya told a big crowd in Tegucigalpa alongside the region's progressive leaders. We're here to tell Hondurans, Central Americans, Latin Americans, and all societies on the planet, that Honduras and the Honduran people don't have to ask permission from any imperialists to sign on to ALBA.
El ALBA TCP, Petrocaribe.
Back in the day, I did quite a bit of research and reporting into ALBA. I even covered an ALBA conference in Venezuela in early 2009. Zelaya was there with his thick signature mustache and his white, wide-brimmed cowboy hat, arm in arm with the region's progressive presidents. Washington called them the so-called bad left because they were bucking the Monroe Doctrine, carving their own path forward, away from the United States. Felix Molina is a well-known Honduran journalist who would play an important role in covering the resistance following the coup, which we'll get into in a second.
It
became pretty clear, he says, with the opening of Manuel Zelaya's government to Petrocaribe, to the role that the Zelaya government played in the end of the planned free trade area of the Americas, joining ALBA, and the presence of presidents at that time, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez, in the Honduran capital in August 2008. You could tell that something powerful was moving in the country.
No pueden atentar contra el derecho del pueblo de opinar.
Meanwhile, at home, Zelaya was making reforms for the poor working class. They weren't big, but they were more than any other president had done.
He was tremendously interested in maintaining the support of the business class, but he also was trying to make minor changes.
Anthropologist Adrian Pine has spent years working in and around Honduras.
He was responding to powerful demands from social movements. He was responding to their demands for a number of things, for increased minimum wage, for increases for protecting pensions, for improving healthcare, things like that. So he made a number of small reforms. And then, of course, the most important reform that he agreed to consider was what was called the Cuarta Urna, which was basically on June 28th, 2009, he had scheduled a non-binding poll nationwide, which asked people if they would like to have a referendum on the November election of that same year about whether or not there should be a constituent assembly to rewrite the Honduran constitution, which had been written under a dictatorship in 1982 and was profoundly anti-democratic. And so that was the real motivation for the coup. That was the straw that broke the camel's back.
This idea of the Constituent Assembly was embraced by many of the social movements and the more progressive countries in the region. Venezuela held one in 1999, Bolivia, 2006, Ecuador in 2007. Now, I know this might sound weird for folks from the U.S., where our Constitution is more than 200 years old, but many Latin American countries have had multiple constitutions. They're often revised when there's a break from the past, like amid dictatorship or return to democracy. In Honduras, it's often talked about in terms of, quote, refounding the country. In the mid-2000s, constitutional rewrites were seen as a way to leave the authoritarian past behind by enshrining greater civic and human rights, labor protections, and social justice into these countries' founding documents. And these constitutions weren't written by elites in secretive back rooms, but by large assemblies elected by the people. In other words, the Constituent Assembly process was seen as a powerful democratic way forward. But for protectors of the status quo, it was also very dangerous. June 28th, 2009, pre-dawn. Hondurans are expecting to wake up and vote in the non-binding nationwide poll asking them if they'd like to hold a referendum on whether or not to convene a constituent assembly. But instead, military officers awaken President Manuel Zelaya at gunpoint. They whisk him away to Tocantins Airport. There, they put him on a plane, which flies to Sotocano Air Base to refuel. You'll remember Sotocano from the last episode, the most important U.S. base in Central America. The plane then flies him to Costa Rica and dumps him unceremoniously on the runway in San Jose. Congress conspires with the Supreme Court to try and paint the coup as legitimate and institutional. The excuse? Those behind the coup said his poll was a veiled attempt to remain in power. See, presidential re-election is illegal under Honduras' 1982 constitution. A constituent assembly, an eventual new constitution, could change that. Of course, that wouldn't happen until after the next election, in which Zelaya wouldn't even be allowed to compete. But for the coup plotters, it was justification enough.
Prometo ser fiel a la República, a la Constitución y a las leyes.
The president of the National Assembly, Roberto Micheleri, takes power. He immediately orders the military to enforce a curfew.
Él ya cometió delitos contra la Constitución y contra las leyes.
Zelaya committed crimes against the Constitution and the laws, Micheleri would tell the international press. He can't come back to be president. Meanwhile, the country awakens to the news. People hit the streets to demand Zelaya be reinstated as president. Journalist Felix Molina was there. Some people were still out expecting to vote, he says. So there was this feeling that's mixed between the consulta, or the vote that people were going to participate in, and the shock of what has happened. There was a massive military presence at the presidential palace. There were moments of confusion, but at the same time, a lot of passion, where we begin to understand that this is serious. Felix says the people realized they couldn't wait for the details over the radio and television because local news outlets weren't reporting on what was happening. It was a media blackout. Instead, Felix says, the people came together on the streets to share information, to inform one another. That's what I really remember from that first day, he says. It set the scene for so many days to come, because it was the organized social movements that became the motor to channel the collective grassroots energy that was being expressed throughout the country. The protests would ripple on for months, as would the government backlash. That in a minute.
Hey everyone, Maximilian Alvarez here, editor-in-chief of the Real News Network. We're going to get you right back to the program in a sec, I promise, but really quick, I just wanted to remind y'all that The Real News is an independent, viewer and listener-supported grassroots media network. We don't take corporate cash, we don't have ads, and we never ever put our reporting behind paywalls. But we cannot continue to do this work without your support. It takes a lot of time, energy, and money to produce powerful, unique, and journalistically rigorous shows like Under the Shadow. So if you want more vital storytelling and reporting like this, we need you to become a supporter of The Real News now. Just head over to therealnews.com/donate and donate today. It really makes a difference. Also, if you're enjoying Under the Shadow, then you will definitely want to follow NACLA, the North American Congress on Latin America. NACLA's reporting and analysis goes beyond the headlines to help you understand what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean from a progressive perspective. Visit NACLA.org to learn more. That's NACLA.org. All right, thanks for listening. Back to the show.
So, following the coup d'etat in the capital of Tegucigalpa, there was 180 straight days of street protests.
That's Jesse Freeston. He's a Canadian filmmaker who moved to Honduras following the 2009 coup to cover the protests and the aftermath for The Real News. He would go on to make a documentary called Resistencia, or Resistance, about the campesino struggle in the Awan Valley.
Every morning, everybody would start gathering outside one of the universities there, and they would march down the street. And almost every day, it would get attacked in one form or another by the police. It kind of became this repeating theater play. But one of the things that was happening there, not just trying to keep Honduras in the news and trying to keep this coup d'etat illegitimate visually, the other thing that was happening there was that there was just a school, a political science school, an economics school happening on the streets. There's so much news and materials being passed around and all the graffitis and slogans being put everywhere. And I think in the process, one of the main things that happened is that the oligarchy's mask kind of fell. That's a rough translation of something people would say. In that all of a sudden people were aware of who owned the country and what did they own and who had done what to make this coup happen.
They founded a movement, the National Front Against the Coup, which would later become the National Front of Popular Resistance.
There was an unbelievable amount of organization that was happening to try and bring back the overthrown regime and also to move ahead with this project that had absolutely captured the imagination of the Honduran people, which was the constituente, the new constitution.
And people were organizing not just in Tegucigalpa, but across the country.
Committees in every single one of Honduras' 298 municipalities. And those committees had subcommittees on like 20 different themes, everything from LGBT rights to housing.
¿Qué tal? Buenas noches, bienvenidos y bienvenidas al programa de este 26 de noviembre. De nuevo, las máscaras antigases.
It was in these early days, with the media blackout across the local press, that journalist Felix Molina decided to found a daily radio show that would showcase the voices of those on the front lines. That's a clip from one of his shows a few years into the coup. He aptly called it Resistance, and later Resistance is Resistencias, to underscore the multifaceted and diverse forms of organizing and street protest across the country. Felix says that in Tegucigalpa, it was a largely urban resistance. Big youth presence, university students, people from the poor communities who weren't necessarily organized, informal workers, street vendors, with a large presence of women teachers.
Lempira, departamentos indígenas, lencas.
But in the indigenous Lenca departments, it was another type of resistance, much more determined to fight, body to body, people with conviction, he says, which was very different from the resistance on the Atlantic coast with a Garifuna component, Caribbean, with a huge presence of spiritual Garifuna symbology. There was always smoke, incense, drumming. He says their methods were different, but they were all united in their one goal of, quote, reclaiming the dignity of the nation, rebuilding the rule of law, the return of Manuel Zelaya, the return of democracy. Jesse Freeston.
The thing you need to understand here is that what Zelaya represents in this story is the first person in the history of the Honduran political class that actually paid a price for standing up for the impoverished majority in Honduras. So it's not just appreciation and love for this man because he's so charismatic or whatever. What's happening here is they've actually seen somebody face down the threat of saying, if you continue to do this, if you keep pushing for this new constitution, if you keep standing by this raising of the minimum wage, if you keep pushing for this very meager land reform, if you keep pushing for these things, we're going to overthrow you in a coup. And these threats were made, and Zelaya said, bring it on. And he ended up in his pajamas on a runway in Costa Rica. And so the fact that he paid this price, being somebody who was from the oligarchy, from the traditional political class, this is how he earned the respect of the Honduran people.
Se ha presentado este mismo día denuncia penal.
Felix Molina's radio show, like that of Radio Venceremos 3 decades before in neighboring El Salvador, became kind of the voice of resistance in Honduras. It was available online, but also over the airwaves via the radio station Radio Global, although Felix and his team actually had to pay the station for the airtime to broadcast the show. When the military moved to block the signal, people in the communities played the show online and began to connect loudspeakers so their neighbors could also listen in.
Ellos controlan las telefónicas y pueden cortar las señales.
The elites control the telephone lines and they can cut the signals. They control the National TV Commission and they can cut radio and TV frequencies. But they can't cut the connections between people, says Felix. The capacity to meet together and to invent. The people will react as they have before, like how they created a type of loudspeaker radio. They are creative. But the backlash was brutal. Karen Spring is a Canadian human rights activist who moved to Honduras in the days following the coup. She's been there ever since.
But then what the coup did is that like it all of a sudden the state realized like, oh no, all these poor people, which is the majority of the country, know who their enemies are, and it's us. And so what do we need to do? Well, we, are taking control of the state and ingraining in it at a deeper level this neoliberal model. We need to make the surveillance systems of the state. We need to make the intelligence structures of the military and the police more sophisticated, give them more equipment. They need to be more monitoring enemies. We need to put the military in the streets to basically, keep people controlled and like a form of social control.
Rápido. Ahora en el 2009.
Berto Oliva, the founder of COFADE, the committee of family members of the detained and disappeared in Honduras, says the 2009 coup was an even greater setback for the country than in the 1980s. It rolled us back 50 years, she says. When we thought we had a moment when the government was finally willing to listen to the people in 2009, that's when they carried out the coup d'etat, she says. And it was different from what we experienced in the 1980s, because the brutality could not be hidden as it was hidden in silence before. In 2009, it was clear to the entire world that democratic values and the rule of law were destroyed in just a couple of hours. Berta's organization, COFADE, played a key role in defending the victims and denouncing the human rights violations carried out by the state. According to one 2010 COFADE report, in the first 6 months after the coup, there were 38 politically motivated killings.
La policía y el ejército.
The police and the army repress. They disappeared people. They're victims in the streets. People raped and dead as a result of the confrontations with the state, says Felix. The people suffered torture throughout the country. They were thrown into rivers. There was the forced disappearance of people again, hidden in clandestine cells, brutally killed at point-blank range in broad daylight so everyone would see. Atrocious crimes. But the protests continued. On the streets, they sang one song in particular.
Nos tienen miedo porque no tenemos miedo. Nos tienen miedo porque no tenemos miedo. Nos tienen miedo porque no tenemos miedo. Nos tienen miedo porque no tenemos miedo.
The words go, "They are afraid of us because we are not afraid." It was written a few years before the coup by the Argentine singer Liliana Felipe. Her sister and brother-in-law were disappeared during Argentina's reign of state terror of the late 1970s and early 80s. She fled the country. She's lived in Mexico ever since. Honestly, the fact that this became one of the anthems for the people on the streets of Honduras is so profound, particularly when you think about the deep levels of violence and fear shoved on the Honduran people throughout the 1980s, as we looked at in the last episode. Jesse Freeston.
And people would, like in the middle of the march, stop and sing this song. And so actually, at least in superficially, the fear was not evident. And this was a bit surprising to me, to be honest, that with all the repression that was happening, that people were still going out every day and painting the walls and marching and putting themselves at great risk.
¿Están cansados? ¿Tienen miedo?
And that was, in part, a conscious decision, not to dwell on the fear and the violence, but to celebrate the hope and the change that was possible.
Por guardar ese emblema divino, marcharemos, oh patria, la muerte.
De algún modo adoptamos el discurso de no tener miedo.
Felix says that at the radio, they intentionally focused less on the things that cause collective fear and more on what he calls the pro-positive discourse against fear, like raising people's awareness and getting them active in the growing social movement.
No queremos gobierno de facto. No queremos golpes de Estado.
At the time, it was really common to hear that Hondurans in general woke up because of the coup. They became politicized.
Fue, como bien lo dijo la gente.
As people said, the blindfolds were taken off, says Felix. The blindfolds that stopped them from seeing how power works in the country. Today, the people can identify the 10 most powerful capitalist families in Honduras. Today, the people can clearly see the role of the United States in Honduras. And Felix says the radio played an important role.
Entonces, pero sí, la radio
The radio was central to both the mobilizations of political consciousness and the mobilizations of people into the streets, he says. With all modesty, that was my greatest achievement as one of the directors of the program. But this work was not without risks, as we will see.
Bien, la Secretaría ha registrado 33 votos.
Meanwhile, the international community was adamantly against the coup. They refused to recognize the de facto Honduran government.
La comunidad internacional.
They don't recognize Honduras in the General Assembly of the United Nations, says Felix, nor in the Organization of American States. Well, at least that is most of the international community. Alex Main is the Director of International Policy at CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He's been researching and denouncing the Honduran coup and the U.S. role since day one.
Well, I mean, there's still a lot of questions about what the role of the U.S. was before the coup, how the U.S. may have been involved in supporting the coup. And, you know, there's a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence that suggests that the U.S. had to be in the know ahead of the coup. For one, because the relationship between the U.S. military and the Honduran military is so deep and has been for so many decades.
In other words, he says, remember where the plane carrying Zelaya on the morning of the coup stopped to refuel on its way to Costa Rica? Sotocano, or Palmerola, the largest U.S. base in Central America. That's the spot I visited last episode. A colleague of Alex Main's even found that a U.S. military attaché had met with senior commanders of the Honduran army the night before the coup. Publicly, the U.S. did finally come out against the coup.
Good evening. I am honored to join you here today, and I want to thank...
Remember, this was the first year of Barack Obama. Just 2 months before the coup, Obama had promised to usher in a new era of U.S.-Latin American relations at the 2009 Summit of the Americas.
But I pledge to you that we seek an equal partnership. There is no senior partner and junior partner in our relations.
And following the coup, the U.S. did stand against it, kind of.
They took their time. There was a little bit of foot dragging. They weren't very quick at doing so, but they did eventually join the rest of the region. There was a strong resolution that came out of the Organization of American States at the time that the U.S. supported, which kicked Honduras out of the Organization of American States because of the coup that had taken place.
But even though Obama did call it a coup, the United States, and in particular, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were working behind the scenes to ensure that Zelaya would not return to power.
Honduras had been this reliable ally for years and years. It had served as a platform for the U.S. military, in particular for carrying out intervention in the rest of the region. But it was a country that the U.S. was not prepared to let go of, in the sense that they were not prepared for the government of that country to, start carrying out policies that went against the sort of U.S. agenda in the region. They did not want Honduras to fall.
Jesse Freeston.
So if you looked at the U.S. State Department, the New York Times, certain key kind of communicators during this time, they were opposing the coup in words. We would find out later through WikiLeaks and Hillary Clinton's emails that behind the scenes they were doing a lot to keep the regime in power. But that all changed in this election that they held about 4 or 5 months after the coup.
And that was by design. In the first edition of Hillary Clinton's 2014 memoir, Hard Choices, she wrote, "We strategized on a plan to restore order to Honduras and ensure that free and fair elections could be held quickly and legitimately, which would render the question of Zelaya moot." For the United States and the Honduran coup government of Roberto Michelledi, the election was the get-out-of-jail-free card. a way to shove the memory of the coup into the past and pretend like a new democratic leaf had been turned. And that is where we will go next time, to the elections that would consolidate the 2009 coup and deepen the privatizations, to the repression and the exodus of Hondurans fleeing a failed state and propped up with the help of the United States.
El golpe fue una acción.
Journalist Felix Molina says the coup was an action taken by the elites to both ingrain neoliberalism in the country and an action to strengthen the model of organized crime in the country. Human rights defender Karen Spring told me something in 2023 that really stuck with me because it gives this 2009 coup important historical context and it really sets the scene for the next episode.
There was the actual repression after the coup, and then there was like everything that sort of happened since the coup. And Honduras sort of entered, as a result of the coup, it entered like a massive human rights crisis that started with the coup. Certainly there was elements before the coup, but it sort of sparked a whole new sort of chapter in the human rights crisis of Honduras that a lot of people link to the 80s and the disappearances in the 80s and the repression against the left or anyone identified slightly as being progressive under the communist, the whole McCarthy era Cold War rhetoric.
The past is never far behind. That is all for this episode of Under the Shadow. Next week, I'll bring you part 2, the conclusion. As always, if you like what you hear, please check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/MFOX. There you can also support my work, become a monthly sustainer, or sign up to stay abreast of all the latest on this podcast and my other reporting across Latin America. Under the Shadow is a co-production in partnership with The Real News and NACLA. The theme music is by my band Monte Perdido. This is Michael Fox. Many thanks. See you next time.
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work, so please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.